Hello, dear history travelers, and welcome back to another journey through time. I'm so grateful you've chosen to be here with me today as we explore one of history's most deliberately obscured truths, the story of women who wielded power in ages that insisted they had none. Before we begin unraveling these extraordinary tales of intelligence, strategy, and resilience, I want to ask for your support. If you value these deep explorations into the forgotten corners of history, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and click that notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing these silenced voices back to life. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me which historical woman's story you'd most like to hear. Every comment matters, and your suggestions shape our content. Now, settle in somewhere comfortable, perhaps with a warm cup of tea, and prepare to meet women whose names should be as famous as any kings, whose intelligence shaped nations, and whose stories have been waiting centuries to be fully told. Let's step together into the hidden corridors of power where queens ruled in silence. Imagine standing in a grand medieval throne room. At the center, on an elevated seat of carved stone and gilded wood, sits a king. He wears the crown, holds the scepter, issues the commands. Scribes record his words. Nobles bow before him. History will remember his name, his reign, his decisions. But look closer. Look to the shadows. There, just behind the throne or seated to the side in a chair that's slightly smaller but no less significant, is a woman. She wears no crown, or perhaps a smaller, less ornate one. She holds no scepter. When she speaks, it's in whispers, in suggestions, in carefully framed advice. The scribes don't always record her words. The nobles may not bow quite as deeply. But watch what happens. Watch as the king leans back to consult her before making a decision. Watch as her quiet word in his ear changes the course of a negotiation. Notice how the nobles who want something from the king first seek an audience with her. Observe how ambassadors from foreign courts carry letters addressed not just to the king, but to her as well, knowing that she is the true path to influence. This woman, this queen, this regent, this royal mother or wife is the real power in the room. But history, written by men who couldn't acknowledge this reality, will barely mention her. Her intelligence will be called wifely advice. Her political acumen will be dismissed as feminine intuition. Her strategic brilliance will be attributed to the men she advised. Her very power will be denied even as everyone who lived through her era knew the truth. This is the reality of medieval female power. It was everywhere and nowhere, acknowledged and denied, feared and dismissed. Absolutely essential, yet officially non-existent. Today, we're going to pierce through the silence. We're going to meet women who ruled empires without officially ruling anything. We'll discover the strategies they used to navigate systems designed to exclude them. We'll explore how they wielded influence when law and custom said they should have none. And we'll understand why their stories were deliberately obscured and why recovering them matters so much. We'll meet Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was queen of 2 nations and mother to kings, who outlived her enemies through sheer strategic brilliance. We'll encounter Empress Theodora of Byzantium, who rose from the theater to become co-ruler of an empire and saved her husband's throne with her courage. We'll discover Isabella of Castile, who funded Columbus and unified Spain while fighting for recognition of her own legitimate authority. We'll also meet women whose names you might not know, but whose influence was just as profound. The queen mothers who ruled for decades in the name of child kings. The consorts whose pillow talk shaped foreign policy. The regents who held kingdoms together during wars and plagues. The abbesses who commanded wealth and influence rivaling any lords. These women lived in a world that told them they were inferior, incapable, unsuited for power. And yet they seized it anyway, wielded it brilliantly, and changed the course of history. Their stories are a masterclass in strategy, resilience, and the creative use of limited options. They prove that power takes many forms and that some of the most effective rulers in history were women who officially held no power at all. So let's begin. Let's step into the corridors where power whispered rather than shouted, where influence flowed through unofficial channels, where the most important decisions were made far from the public throne room. Let's discover when queens ruled in silence. If we're going to discuss women who ruled in silence, we must begin with Eleanor of Aquitaine, though silence isn't quite the right word for a woman who lived as loudly as she did, even when official history tried to quiet her voice. Eleanor was born around 1122 into extraordinary privilege. She was the daughter and heiress of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, which meant she inherited the largest and wealthiest duchy in France, larger and richer, in fact, than the holdings of the French king himself. At 15 years old, Eleanor wasn't just wealthy and noble, she was the greatest marriage prize in Europe, and she knew it. Her father's dying wish was that she marry the son of the French king. And so, at 15, Eleanor became Queen of France through marriage to Louis VII. Here's where her story becomes instructive about the nature of female power in the medieval period. Eleanor brought Aquitaine, its lands, its wealth, its strategic importance, to this marriage. In legal terms of the era, this meant Louis now controlled Aquitaine through his wife. But anyone who met Eleanor quickly realized that while Louis might legally control the duchy, Eleanor controlled Louis. She was educated, cultured, politically astute, and strong-willed in ways that her pious, monk-like husband simply wasn't. From the very beginning of their marriage, Eleanor exercised power. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, unusual for a queen, but completely in character for Eleanor, who wanted to see the world and be part of great events, not sit quietly in France. During the Crusade, she advised on strategy, managed logistics, and even had her own contingent of knights. Chronicles from the period show thinly veiled disapproval of a woman so publicly involved in military affairs, but they also show she was impossible to ignore. The marriage to Louis eventually failed. They were fundamentally incompatible, and Eleanor had produced only daughters, not the male heir France needed. But here's where Eleanor's story becomes a masterclass in turning constraint into opportunity. When the marriage was annulled in 1552, Eleanor could have returned to Aquitaine as a wealthy but politically sidelined duchess. Instead, within weeks, possibly within days, she married Henry of Anjou, who would soon become Henry II of England. This wasn't a passive arranged marriage. This was Eleanor choosing her own path, selecting a younger, more ambitious, more dynamic partner who appreciated her political mind and the territorial wealth she brought. Think about the audacity of this. Eleanor essentially swapped one crown for another, from being Queen of France to becoming Queen of England, all while maintaining her own independent power base in Aquitaine. She was now wife to the English king, but she was also duchess in her own right, ruling Aquitaine personally with her own court, her own administrators, her own authority.
For the next decades, Eleanor was the power behind Henry's throne, and sometimes beside it. She managed Aquitaine brilliantly, handling complex feudal relationships, mediating disputes, and building alliances. She bore Henry 8 children, including the future kings Richard I and John. She established a court in Aquitaine that became a center of culture, patronizing poets and troubadours, effectively inventing what we now call courtly love. But Eleanor's relationship with power was never simple or passive. When her marriage to Henry soured, partly due to his infidelities, partly due to political disagreements, Eleanor didn't quietly accept her diminished role. Instead, she encouraged her sons to rebel against their father. This was an astonishing act of political boldness. Eleanor backed her sons in open warfare against her husband, the king. She was captured and imprisoned for this. Henry kept her under house arrest for 16 years. But even imprisonment couldn't completely neutralize Eleanor's power. She continued to be consulted on important matters. Her sons knew she was their mother and supporter. Her very existence as a legitimate claimant to significant power meant she couldn't be completely ignored. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor was immediately freed by her son Richard, now King Richard I. And here, at an age when most medieval people were considered elderly, she was 67, Eleanor entered perhaps the most powerful phase of her life. Richard trusted his mother completely. When he went on crusade, he left Eleanor as his representative in England. When he was captured and held for ransom, Eleanor organized the collection of the enormous sum needed to free him. She traveled across Europe in her 70s, negotiating treaties, arranging marriages, and exercising royal authority in Richard's name. And after Richard died, when her youngest son, John, took the throne, Eleanor, now in her 80s, continued to serve as advisor, mediator, and power behind the throne. She helped John maintain his grip on power during the early, unstable years of his reign. She negotiated with the French king. She traveled to Spain to select a bride for the French heir, strengthening alliances. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204, at approximately 82 years old, an extraordinary age for the medieval period. She had been queen of 2 different nations, duchess in her own right of the richest territory in France, mother to 3 kings, patron of the arts, crusader, prisoner, rebel, and regent. She had shaped European politics for 70 decades. And yet, if you read many medieval chronicles written by men, you'll find her portrayed primarily as a disruptive influence, a woman who overstepped her proper bounds, whose political involvement was scandalous, and whose rebellion against her husband was particularly condemned. The monks who wrote history couldn't quite deny her existence or importance, but they could judge her harshly for exercising the power she so obviously possessed. What Eleanor teaches us is that medieval women's power was always conditional and contested, even for the most privileged. She had every advantage: noble birth, wealth, beauty, intelligence, and the strong personality to use all of it. Yet she still had to constantly negotiate, maneuver, and fight for the power that men of equivalent rank would have exercised without question. Eleanor's primary tools of power were strategic marriage, control of wealth and territory, maternal influence over powerful sons, and sheer force of personality combined with political intelligence. She understood the system's rules and worked within them when necessary, but she also pushed boundaries constantly, testing how far a woman could go. Her legacy is complex. She didn't overthrow the patriarchal system. That wasn't possible. But she proved it could be navigated, manipulated, and occasionally defied by a woman clever and bold enough to try. She showed that power behind the throne could sometimes mean power beside it, or in front of it, or independent of it entirely. Eleanor's story also reveals something crucial about how we understand medieval power. Traditional history focuses on kings, on public displays of authority, on official roles and titles. But real power often worked differently. It flowed through relationships, through control of wealth, through strategic marriages and alliances, through the ability to influence those who officially ruled. Eleanor mastered this unofficial power game so completely that she became more powerful than most men of her era, despite all the legal and social barriers designed to prevent exactly that. She ruled in her own voice when she could, and in silence, or rather through others when she had to, but she always ruled. Her story is just the beginning. Throughout medieval Europe, countless women were playing similar games, wielding similar power, and being similarly erased from official history. Eleanor is exceptional in how successful and visible she was, but she's representative of a much larger phenomenon. Let's continue exploring it.
Now let's travel east to Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire, and meet perhaps the most remarkable example of a woman rising from nothing to absolute power, the Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian I, and arguably the most powerful woman in 6th century Europe. Theodora's story begins in the most unlikely place for a future empress, the theater. Born around 500 CE, she was the daughter of a bear keeper at the Hippodrome, essentially an entertainer in the chariot racing stadium. This was among the lowest social classes in Byzantine society. Theodora and her sisters became actresses, which in Byzantine culture was barely distinguishable from prostitution. Actresses performed bawdy comedic sketches, and sexual services were often an expected part of their work. We know this because the historian Procopius wrote about it extensively, gleefully, in a scandalous secret history that detailed Theodora's alleged sordid past. Procopius wanted to humiliate and discredit Theodora by documenting her lowly origins and supposed sexual escapades. Ironically, he gave us a detailed portrait of a woman of extraordinary determination and intelligence, even as he tried to portray her as immoral. At some point in her youth, Theodora left Constantinople and traveled to North Africa, possibly as a courtesan, possibly seeking a better life. What changed during this period, we don't know for certain, but when she returned to Constantinople, she had transformed herself. She had adopted a dignified lifestyle, made connections with influential people, and caught the attention of Justinian, then heir to the imperial throne. Justinian fell deeply in love with Theodora. This much is clear from all sources, even the hostile ones. But there was a massive problem. Byzantine law prohibited senators and other high-ranking officials from marrying actresses or women of low birth. Justinian's uncle, the reigning emperor Justin I, would have to change the law for the marriage to be possible. And this is exactly what happened. The law was changed. Justinian and Theodora married around 225 CE, and when Justinian became emperor in 237 CE, Theodora became empress. Not just a consort with a courtesy title, but an active co-ruler with significant legal authority. This is where Theodora's story becomes a profound lesson in how women wielded power. Unlike Western European queens who exercised influence indirectly, Theodora had official status. Byzantine culture, despite many patriarchal elements, had a tradition of powerful empresses. Theodora used this framework brilliantly. She was crowned alongside Justinian in an elaborate ceremony that treated them as joint rulers. Imperial edicts were issued in both their names. Ambassadors from foreign courts had to pay homage to both emperor and empress. Theodora held her own court, received petitioners, made decisions on legal cases, and issued orders that were obeyed as if they came from the emperor himself. But Theodora's real genius was in how she exercised this power. She didn't just enjoy the pomp at ceremony, she used her position to shape policy in profound ways. First, she championed women's rights in ways that were revolutionary for the era. She pushed through laws that prohibited forced prostitution and created refuges for women trying to leave sex work, essentially the first women's shelters in recorded history. She expanded women's property rights and made it easier for women to divorce abusive husbands. Having experienced vulnerability and exploitation herself, she used her power to protect other women. Second, she became Justinian's most trusted advisor on virtually everything. Sources describe her as his intellectual equal, someone he consulted on military strategy, foreign policy, religious doctrine, and administrative reform. The great legal code that Justinian produced, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which became the foundation of European law, was created during a reign where Theodora was actively involved in governance. We can't know exactly which provisions she influenced, but we know she was there, engaged, contributing. Third, and most dramatically, Theodora literally saved Justinian's throne and possibly his life during the Nika riots of 532. Let me tell you this story because it's one of the most dramatic moments in Byzantine history, and it shows Theodora at her most powerful. In January 532, riots erupted in Constantinople over chariot racing factions, but they quickly evolved into a full-scale revolt against Justinian's rule. The city burned. Rebels declared a new emperor. The emperor's palace was surrounded. For days, the emperor and his advisors debated what to do as the situation grew desperate. Finally, with the palace about to be overrun, Justinian's advisors urged him to flee. Ships were prepared in the harbor for the emperor's escape. The consensus was that running was the only way to save his life, even if it meant losing the throne forever. This is when Theodora made her famous speech. According to the historian Procopius, who, despite disliking her, couldn't deny what happened, Theodora stood before the council and said, "Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is neither here nor there. As to the belief that a woman ought not to be daring among men or assert herself boldly among those who are holding back from fear, I consider that the present crisis most certainly does not permit us to discuss whether the matter should be regarded in this way or in some other way. For the case of those whose interests have come into the greatest danger, nothing else seems best, except to settle the issue immediately before them in the best way possible. My opinion, then, is that the present time, above all others, is inopportune for flight, even though it brings safety. For one who has been an emperor, it is unbearable to be a fugitive. As for myself, I approve a certain ancient saying that royalty is a good burial shroud." In essence, Theodora said, "I would rather die as an empress than live as a refugee. Run if you want, but I'm staying." And this shamed and inspired Justinian and his advisors to stay and fight. They did. Justinian's general Belisarius led troops into the hippodrome where the rebels had gathered and massacred them. Brutal, but effective. Justinian's throne was saved, and Theodora's courage in that moment became legendary.
Think about what this means. In the most critical moment of Justinian's reign, when male advisors counseled retreat, it was Theodora who provided the steel-spined resolve to hold firm. Her courage, her understanding of power, that an emperor who flees is finished, and her willingness to die rather than compromise, these saved the Byzantine Empire's greatest emperor. After the Nika riots, Theodora's power was even more secure. She continued to shape policy, engage in diplomacy, and govern alongside Justinian until her death in 548. When she died, Justinian was reportedly devastated and never fully recovered. The quality of his governance declined after her death, suggesting how much he had relied on her partnership. Theodora's story teaches us several crucial lessons about female power in the medieval world. First, it shows that women could exercise direct official power when the cultural and legal framework permitted it. Byzantine tradition allowed for powerful empresses in ways Western European custom didn't, and Theodora maximized this opportunity. Second, it demonstrates that women's prior experiences, even traumatic or marginal ones, could inform their use of power in positive ways. Theodora's past as a vulnerable woman in exploitative circumstances shaped her policies to protect other vulnerable women. Her low birth origins gave her perspectives that most empresses born to nobility would never have had. Third, it reveals that individual personality and ability mattered enormously. Theodora wasn't powerful just because she married an emperor. Other empresses had done that with far less impact. She was powerful because she was intelligent, courageous, politically astute, and bold enough to claim the space that Byzantine tradition theoretically allowed, but that a less capable woman might not have successfully occupied. Fourth, it shows the power of partnership. Justinian genuinely loved and respected Theodora. He didn't just tolerate her political involvement, he sought it, valued it, and relied on it. Their partnership was one of the most successful ruling partnerships in Byzantine history, proving that when men in power chose to share it with capable women, everybody benefited. Finally, Theodora's story shows how female power was always judged differently than male power. Justinian's ruthlessness was seen as strength, Theodora's was seen as vindictiveness. Justinian's ambition was praised, Theodora's was suspicious. Even when she saved his throne, male chroniclers couldn't fully praise her without also condemning her origins, her gender, and her exercise of authority. Theodora ruled not in silence, but in defiance of those who thought women should be silent. She's an exceptional case in how official and visible her power was, but she represents what was possible when barriers were lowered even slightly, when a woman of ability found a pathway to authority and seized it with both hands. Now let's examine a different form of female power that was actually more common and often more accepted than ruling as a wife: the power of the Queen Mother.
the woman who ruled as regent for a child king. Medieval political systems had a built-in vulnerability. When a king died, leaving only a young heir, someone had to govern until the child came of age. While regency councils existed, the most common and often most successful solution was for the child king's mother to serve as regent. This created a fascinating opportunity for female power that was simultaneously accepted because it was maternal, protective, temporary, and contested because it was still a woman wielding authority that belonged to men. Let's meet some of these remarkable queen mothers and understand how they navigated this complex role. We'll start with Blanche of Castile, one of the most successful regents in French history. Born a Spanish princess, Blanche married the future Louis VIII of France and bore him 12 children. When Louis died unexpectedly in 1226, their son Louis IX was only 12 years old. Blanche immediately became regent. The French nobility assumed they could manipulate or sideline this foreign-born widow. They were catastrophically wrong. Blanche proved to be a masterful politician. She faced multiple rebellions from nobles who thought a woman couldn't hold them in check. She defeated them all, sometimes through military force, sometimes through brilliant diplomacy, sometimes by playing different factions against each other. She understood power at an instinctive level that many of the experienced nobles lacked. What's particularly interesting about Blanche is how she used the framework of maternal authority. She didn't claim to rule in her own right. That would have been unacceptable. Instead, she ruled for her son, protecting his inheritance, preserving his throne until he could take power himself. This framing made her authority more palatable to men who would have rebelled against a woman ruling independently.
But make no mistake, Blanche was the ruler. She made military decisions, conducted diplomacy, managed the royal finances, and administered justice. When Louis IX came of age, Blanche gracefully stepped back from official regency and continued to be her son's most trusted advisor for the rest of her life. Louis IX became Saint Louis, one of France's most revered kings, and he never hesitated to credit his mother's wisdom in shaping his reign. Blanche's influence extended even to choosing Louis's wife and then managing the relationship between mother, son, and daughter-in-law, which was reportedly quite tense. Blanche did not easily share her son. When Louis went on crusade, guess who governed France in his absence? Blanche. Even without official regency, she was the obvious choice because everyone knew she was the most capable person available. Blanche's story shows us that maternal power, while more acceptable than other forms of female authority, still had to be constantly negotiated and defended. She faced rebellions and resistance that a male regent probably wouldn't have faced. But she also had access to a form of legitimate authority, the sacred duty of a mother to protect her child's interests, that gave her power a moral weight that was hard to challenge. Let's consider another queen mother, Margaret of Anjou, whom we met briefly in our earlier script on Kings Without Kingdoms, but who deserves deeper examination as a wielder of maternal power. Margaret became Queen of England through marriage to Henry VI, when Henry's mental illness made him incapable of ruling, and when their son Edward was born, Margaret essentially became the leader of the Lancastrian faction during the Wars of the Roses. She didn't have official regency status. That was complicated by her husband being alive but incapacitated, but she wielded power nonetheless. Margaret led armies. She negotiated with foreign powers. She made strategic decisions about alliances and military campaigns. She did all of this in the name of preserving the throne for her son, which gave her actions legitimacy they might not otherwise have had. The historical judgment of Margaret has been harsh. She's often portrayed as a she-wolf, too ambitious, too violent, too willing to fight. But notice what she's being condemned for, doing exactly what any father would do to preserve his son's inheritance. A king fighting for his son's succession would be praised for his devotion and strength. A mother doing the same was seen as unnatural and grasping. Margaret's story is ultimately tragic. She lost, her son was killed, her husband was murdered, and she died in exile.
But her exercise of maternal power during the decades she fought shows both the possibilities and the limits of this form of female authority. Now, let's look at a more successful example, Isabella of Castile, though her path to power was more complex than simple maternal regency. Isabella's claim to the throne of Castile was contested by her half-brother's daughter. Isabella fought a civil war for the throne and won, proving herself a capable military strategist and political operator. She then married Ferdinand of Aragon, unifying Spain's two largest kingdoms. The marriage contract between Isabella and Ferdinand is fascinating because it explicitly laid out shared power in unusual ways. They would rule their respective kingdoms jointly, but Isabella would be Queen of Castile in her own right, not merely as Ferdinand's wife. They famously used the motto, tanto monta, monta tanto, Isabel como Fernando. They amount to the same, Isabella and Ferdinand, emphasizing their equality. In practice, they governed as partners, but Isabella held her own. She managed Castilian finances independently. She made decisions about her kingdom's military campaigns. When Columbus came seeking funding for his voyage, it was ultimately Isabella who said yes, using Castilian resources to finance the expedition that would discover the New World. After Isabella's death, Ferdinand tried to claim Castile through his daughter Joanna, Isabella's heir, but Castilian law was clear. Isabella had been queen in her own right, and her kingdom passed to her daughter, not to her widower. Female inheritance and authority, when enshrined in law, could create opportunities for women's power. Isabella also exercised power through her daughter, arranging the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to the English heir. She envisioned a grand alliance system connecting Spain to England to the Holy Roman Empire to other powers, all managed through strategic marriages of her children. This was power operating through family networks, a particularly feminine form of political strategy that Isabella deployed brilliantly. Moving to England, we find Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII and one of the most politically astute women in English history. Margaret never ruled officially, but she was the power behind her son's throne throughout his reign. Margaret had an extraordinary talent for survival and strategic thinking. During the Wars of the Roses, when fortunes shifted rapidly and yesterday's ally was tomorrow's traitor, Margaret navigated treacherous waters to preserve her son's claim to the throne and eventually help him win it. After Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field, Margaret became My Lady the King's Mother, a title she essentially created for herself that gave her status without any clear constitutional basis. She signed documents as Margaret R., Regina, Queen, even though she was never actually queen. She dressed in royal style, maintained a magnificent household, and advised her son on virtually everything. Henry listened. Margaret helped arrange his marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist claims. She advised on religious matters, on appointments, on policy. She founded colleges at Cambridge and promoted education. She exercised power through her son so effectively that she became one of the most influential people in England, all without ever holding official office. What all these queen mothers teach us is that maternal authority was one of the few forms of female power that medieval culture could accept because it fit within the framework of women as nurturers and protectors. A mother protecting her child's interests was doing what mothers were supposed to do. It just happened that when the child was a king, protecting his interests meant running a kingdom. But this acceptance was always conditional and contested. Queen mothers faced rebellions, resistance, and criticism that male regents didn't face. They had to be better, smarter, more strategic, just to achieve what men could do with less effort. And they had to be constantly aware that their power was derivative. It came through their sons, and it could be taken away if their sons turned against them or died. Yet within these constraints, many queen mothers became extraordinary rulers. They proved that when women were given even a narrow pathway to power, many were capable of exercising it brilliantly. The question wasn't whether women could rule. These women demonstrated they absolutely could. The question was whether the system would allow them to, and under what conditions. Now, we must discuss the form of female power that's most often dismissed, mocked, and misunderstood: the influence that queens and royal consorts exercised through their intimate relationships with kings. This is often reduced to pillow talk or sexual manipulation in both historical sources and modern portrayals, but the reality was far more complex and far more politically significant. Let's be clear from the start. Intimate access to powerful men was one of the few resources available to women in a patriarchal system. Using that access to influence policy wasn't manipulation, it was politics, and some women became extraordinarily skilled at this particular form of political operation. We'll begin with Empress Irene of Byzantium, who ruled in her own name and even called herself emperor, not empress, in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. But before she ruled openly, she exercised power for years through her husband, Emperor Leo IV, and then through her son, Constantine VI. Irene's main political concern was the iconoclasm controversy, a massive religious dispute about whether religious images should be allowed in Christian worship. Irene strongly supported the veneration of icons, religious images, while the official imperial policy was iconoclasm, destroying images. While her husband lived, Irene couldn't openly oppose imperial policy, but she worked quietly, maintaining connections with icon-supporting monks and clergy, positioning allies in key positions, and preparing the ground for policy change. When Leo died and she became regent for her young son, she finally had the authority to act openly, convening a church council that restored icon veneration. This shows sophisticated long-term political strategy. Irene spent years working toward a goal she couldn't openly pursue, using her position and relationships to build the coalition she'd need when opportunity arose. This isn't the impulsive feminine wiles of the stereotype. This is patient, intelligent political maneuvering. Moving to France, let's consider Madame de Maintenon, the second wife of Louis XIV. She married Louis secretly, late in his life, and never had official status as queen. Yet she became one of the most influential people at Versailles, shaping Louis's policies in his final decades. Maintenon's power came from several sources. First, she had Louis's genuine affection and respect. He valued her judgment and sought her advice. Second, she controlled access to the aging king, determining who could see him and when, which is a classic form of political power. Third, she used her position to promote religious and moral reforms at court that aligned with her own convictions. Critics accused Maintenon of manipulating Louis through the bedroom, but this misses the point. She had political goals, promoting piety, supporting certain religious factions, influencing appointments, and she used her relationship with Louis as the tool available to her to pursue those goals. Male advisors used their relationships with the king to influence policy all the time. When a woman did the same, it was called manipulation. In England, we find the fascinating case of Alice Perrers, mistress to the aging Edward III. Alice had no official status whatsoever. She was a commoner and never even achieved the semi-respectable position of acknowledged royal mistress. Yet during Edward's final years, when he was declining mentally and physically, Alice exercised enormous power. She influenced appointments, collected gifts and bribes from those seeking royal favor, and essentially ran access to the king. Parliament eventually moved against her, accusing her of using undue influence over the king and banishing her from court. But the very fact that Parliament felt the need to act against her shows how real her power was. Alice's story is instructive because it shows that even the most vulnerable, least legitimate form of female power, a commoner mistress with no legal status, could be politically significant if the woman was clever and the king was dependent on her. Of course, this form of power was also the most precarious. When Edward died, Alice lost everything immediately. Let's consider a more complex case: Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII. Traditional narratives portray Anne as using sexual attraction to manipulate Henry into breaking with the Catholic Church and marrying her. This is a dramatic oversimplification that misses Anne's actual political sophistication. Anne was well-educated, religiously committed to reform, and politically astute. She didn't just attract Henry sexually, she engaged him intellectually. She discussed theology with him, shared reformist books, and reinforced his own nascent Protestant leanings. She had her own political goals, advancing reform, elevating her family, and used her relationship with Henry to pursue them. Anne also understood power mechanics. She refused to become Henry's mistress, insisting on marriage, which was a high-risk strategy that ultimately paid off, temporarily. She cultivated her own faction at court, promoted reformist bishops and advisors, and actively participated in policy discussions. Her letters show her intervening in appointments, asking favors for supporters, and working the levers of patronage that were crucial to Tudor politics. The fact that this ended badly for Anne, executed on dubious charges of adultery and treason, doesn't mean she wasn't exercising real power while she had it. It means that female power, exercised through intimate relationships with kings, was inherently precarious, dependent on maintaining the king's favor, and vulnerable to factional enemies who could turn the king against her. Now let's examine a different model, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and her husband Francis Stephen. Maria Theresa was ruler in her own right. She inherited the Habsburg domains and defended them successfully during the War of Austrian Succession. But she was married, and her husband was technically co-ruler and had the title of Holy Roman Emperor. In practice, Maria Theresa was clearly the dominant partner politically. Francis handled finances, which he was good at, while Maria Theresa made the strategic decisions. But she was careful to publicly defer to her husband, to consult him, to maintain the fiction that he was the real authority, even when everyone knew otherwise. This shows sophisticated understanding of optics and the importance of maintaining male dignity even when a woman held actual power. Maria Theresa could have openly sidelined her husband, but this would have created political problems and offended sensibilities. By maintaining respectful partnership publicly while actually running the show, she got the power with less resistance. Catherine the Great of Russia offers another perspective. She came to power by overthrowing her husband Peter III in a coup. He died shortly after, possibly murdered. As empress in her own right, Catherine didn't need to exercise power through a man. She was the ruler. But before the coup, Catherine had spent years as the neglected wife of the heir to the Russian throne, and she used that time brilliantly. She learned Russian, which Peter never bothered, studied Russian history and culture, built relationships with key nobles and military officers, and positioned herself as the true Russian patriot in contrast to her German-born husband, who seemed to prefer Prussia. When the moment came to seize power, Catherine had spent years preparing, building coalitions, and making herself the obvious alternative to the unpopular Peter. This long-term strategic thinking while occupying a position of apparent powerlessness is remarkable. Catherine understood that her current lack of power wasn't permanent, and she positioned herself for the opportunity she would eventually create.
What all these examples teach us is that intimate relationships with powerful men were political relationships, whether or not they were also genuinely affectionate or sexual. Women who had access to kings, emperors, and princes used that access politically because it was one of the few tools available to them. This doesn't make the power less real or less significant. Political influence is political influence, regardless of how it's achieved. Male courtiers used friendship, military service, administrative competence, and family connections to influence kings. Women used the resources available to them, which often meant intimate relationships. The mockery and dismissal of this form of power as mere pillow talk or sexual manipulation is itself a political act, an attempt to delegitimize female power by reducing it to the sexual, as if sexual relationships can't also be venues for serious political discussion and influence. The reality is that pillow politicians, women who influenced policy through intimate relationships, were engaging in a form of politics that required intelligence, patience, strategic thinking, and deep understanding of how power actually worked.
They had to know what they wanted, figure out how to frame it persuasively, choose the right moments to raise issues, understand the king's other pressures and concerns, and navigate the jealousies and oppositions of other courtiers. This is sophisticated political work, and some women did it brilliantly. The fact that it happened in bedchambers rather than council chambers doesn't make it less politically significant. Power is power wherever it's exercised. Chapter 5. The Religious Path, Abbesses and Holy Women. Now let's explore a form of power that's often overlooked because it operated outside the usual royal and noble circles, the power wielded by abbesses, prioresses, and other religious women who found in the church a pathway to authority that secular society denied them. In medieval Europe, the church was one of the few institutions where women could hold positions of genuine authority. An abbess of a major monastery could control vast lands, manage hundreds or thousands of people, command significant wealth, and exercise judicial authority over her territories. In many ways, a powerful abbess was the functional equivalent of a secular lord, and she answered to no husband, father, or brother, only to her ecclesiastical superiors and ultimately to God. Let's begin with Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most remarkable figures of the 12th century. Hildegard was a Benedictine abbess, but that bare description doesn't capture her extraordinary range of activities and influence. Hildegard was a mystic who had visions from childhood. She wrote theological treatises, composed music, studied medicine and natural science, wrote about the natural world, corresponded with popes and emperors, and preached publicly, something almost unheard of for a woman in her era. Her writings were widely circulated and respected. Popes sought her advice. Emperors consulted her. What gave Hildegard this authority? Partly her undeniable intelligence and ability, her writings are sophisticated and original, but also her strategic use of her mystical experiences. By framing her ideas as divinely inspired visions, Hildegard could say things that would have been unacceptable coming from an ordinary woman. If she was just offering her own opinions, she could be dismissed, but if God was speaking through her visions, who could argue? This was a brilliant strategy for navigating the constraints on female authority. Hildegard wanted to engage with theology, politics, and natural philosophy, areas supposedly beyond women's capacity. By claiming divine inspiration, she created a pathway to do exactly that. And it worked. Her authority was acknowledged even by those who would normally dismiss women's ideas. Hildegard also founded her own monastery, Rupertsberg, which gave her a base of independent power. As abbess, she controlled significant resources and had authority over her nuns and the monastery's properties. She used this independence to operate as an intellectual and spiritual force in her own right, not dependent on male approval or patronage. Let's consider Hilda of Whitby, who lived in the 7th century England and founded the Double Monastery of Whitby, a religious community that housed both monks and nuns under her authority. Double monasteries were particularly important because they gave abbesses authority over male religious as well as female, a remarkable reversal of usual gender hierarchies. Hilda's monastery became a center of learning and culture. She trained numerous bishops and religious leaders. She hosted the Synod of Whitby, a crucial church council that determined religious practices for England. Her advice was sought by kings and bishops. She was, in effect, one of the most powerful people in early medieval England, and she achieved this entirely through religious channels. Religious life offered women something that secular life rarely did, the possibility of education and intellectual work. Monasteries and convents maintained libraries, produced manuscripts, and valued learning. For a woman with intellectual interests, religious life might be the only option that allowed her to pursue those interests.
Take the case of Roswitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century nun who was also a playwright and poet. She wrote plays in Latin, historical works, and poetry. Her literary output was substantial and sophisticated. As a laywoman, she would likely never have learned to read and write, let alone produce literary works. As a nun in a wealthy monastery with a strong intellectual tradition, she could become an author. This reminds us that power isn't just political authority, it's also the freedom to think, learn, create, and have your work taken seriously. For medieval women, religious life sometimes offered intellectual power that was otherwise unattainable. Let's look at the economic power that major abbesses wielded. The Abbess of Quedlinburg in Germany, for example, ruled over an imperial abbey with vast lands and resources. She had a seat in the imperial diet, the governing assembly of the Holy Roman Empire, one of the very few women with such status. She coined her own money, maintained her own army, and exercised judicial authority over her territories. The Abbess of Quedlinburg was a princess abbess, essentially a secular ruler who happens to be a religious figure. She exercised power that was very similar to a male prince-bishop, showing that when the framework allowed it, women could wield overtly political and military power without it being seen as inappropriate. In Spain, we find Teresa of Avila, a 16th-century nun who reformed the Carmelite order and founded numerous new convents. Teresa was a brilliant administrator and a shrewd operator who navigated church politics, the Inquisition, and secular authorities to achieve her goals. Teresa's mystical writings gave her spiritual authority, but she also understood practical power. She cultivated relationships with wealthy patrons who funded her new convents. She negotiated with church officials to get permissions and approvals. She selected and trained the nuns who would lead her reformed communities. She was building an organization, and she did it with remarkable skill and strategic thinking. Teresa's example shows that even in the early modern period, when many avenues of female power were closing, religious life still offered opportunities. Teresa couldn't have wielded equivalent power in secular life, but as a nun and reformer, she became one of the most influential religious figures of her era. Religious women also exercised power through teaching and cultural influence. Convents ran schools for girls, preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. The education that noble women received often came from convents, meaning that nuns were shaping the minds of future queens and ladies who would themselves wield influence. Moreover, religious women served as confessors and spiritual advisors to powerful people. A queen's confessor or spiritual advisor might have regular private access to her and could influence her thinking on religious and moral matters that had political implications. Some religious women became influential precisely through this role as spiritual counselors to the powerful. The vow of chastity that religious women took was, paradoxically, a form of freedom. By being married to Christ, a nun avoided being married to a human husband. She wasn't subject to a father's or husband's authority in the way laywomen were. Her property wasn't controlled by a man. She could make decisions about her own life within the framework of religious obedience. For some medieval women, this was genuinely liberating. For others, it was the best option in a limited set of choices. Better to be an abbess with authority and respect than a wife with neither. And for many, it was probably both, a genuine religious calling that also offered opportunities for power, learning, and independence that secular life did not provide. Religious power had its limitations. Abbesses still answered to bishops and popes, all of whom were male. Religious women couldn't perform priestly functions, saying Mass, hearing confessions, which were reserved for men. The highest levels of church authority were closed to them. But within these constraints, religious women found remarkable room to maneuver. They created institutions, wielded economic and judicial power, produced intellectual and artistic works, influenced the spiritual lives of the powerful, and sometimes even participated in political decision-making through their status and connections. The religious path to power reminds us that medieval women's options were limited but not non-existent. Women who wanted authority, independence, and the chance to exercise their abilities often found in religious life opportunities that secular life denied them. Convents and monasteries became spaces where female intelligence and leadership could flourish, even in a society that generally denied women these possibilities.
We've met many extraordinary women who wielded power despite living in systems designed to prevent them from doing so. Now let's step back and examine the strategies they used, the patterns and tactics that emerge across different times, places, and circumstances. How did medieval women actually exercise power when they officially had none? Strategy 1. Working through legitimate channels. The most successful medieval women didn't openly defy the system, they worked within it, finding and exploiting the limited legitimate channels available to them. Maternal authority was one such channel. A mother protecting her child's interests was doing what mothers were supposed to do. Queen mothers could exercise enormous power by framing their actions as maternal duty rather than political ambition. Religious authority was another. An abbess exercising power over her monastery wasn't violating gender norms, she was fulfilling her religious role. Women like Hildegard of Bingen could speak authoritatively on theology and politics by framing their ideas as divine visions rather than personal opinions. Even the role of consort offered legitimate channels. A queen was expected to advise her husband, intercede for petitioners, and concern herself with mercy and charity. Clever queens expanded these limited expectations into real political influence. The key was framing. The same action could be acceptable or outrageous depending on how it was presented. A woman making a political decision as regent for her son was acceptable. The same woman making the same decision in her own right was not. Successful women understood this and framed their actions in acceptable terms. Strategy 2. Building networks and factions. Medieval politics operated through personal relationships, patronage, and factional alliances. Women who understood this could build their own power networks. Queens distributed patronage, appointing bishops, granting lands, providing financial support to allies. Each grant created a loyal supporter. Over time, a queen could build a faction of people who owed their positions to her and would support her interests. Women also built networks through marriage alliances, arranging marriages for their children, relatives, and supporters to create webs of family connection and mutual obligation. Isabella of Castile was masterful at this, using her children's marriages to build an alliance system spanning Europe. Religious women built networks too. An abbess might train nuns who would go on to found or lead other convents, creating a network of sister institutions with shared values and mutual support. Strategy 4. Controlling access and information. In systems where power flows through personal access to rulers, controlling that access is itself a form of power. Medieval women frequently exercised this control. A queen who determined who could speak to the king and when had enormous influence. She could promote allies by giving them access and hinder enemies by blocking theirs. She could ensure the king heard certain information and perspectives while filtering out others. Queen mothers often controlled access to their royal sons. Ladies-in-waiting controlled access to queens. Abbesses controlled access to the resources and authority of their monasteries. This gatekeeping function was a consistent source of female power. Strategy 5. Financial independence. Women who controlled their own financial resources had more power than those who didn't. This was why widowhood, despite its social disadvantages, sometimes increased women's power. Widows could control their own property in ways wives often couldn't. Eleanor of Aquitaine's power base was partly financial. She controlled the wealthy duchy of Aquitaine in her own right. Abbesses controlled monastic resources. Queens who had their own revenues from designated lands, dower properties, had resources they could deploy independently. Financial independence also meant being able to reward supporters, fund political activities, and maintain one's own household, all crucial to building and maintaining power. Strategy 6. Strategic patience. Many successful medieval women demonstrated remarkable patience, working toward long-term goals even when immediate circumstances were unfavorable. Catherine the Great spent years as the neglected wife of the Russian heir, using that time to build relationships and position herself for the eventual coup that brought her to power. Empress Irene spent years quietly positioning icon-supporting clergy before openly reversing iconoclasm policy. Many queen mothers spent time in the background while their sons were young, preparing for the moment when they could exercise regency power.
This strategic patience, recognizing when to act and when to wait, was crucial. Women who moved too quickly or obviously often provoked backlash. Those who waited for the right moment and had positioned themselves properly could exercise power more successfully. Strategy 7. Claiming exceptional status. Some women claimed to be exceptions to general rules about female incapability. Yes, most women can't rule, but I am special, was an argument that sometimes worked.
Elizabeth I of England leaned into this, presenting herself as an exceptional woman, specially chosen by God, who had the heart and stomach of a king, even if she had the body but of a weak and feeble woman. By accepting the general premise of female weakness while claiming personal exception, she could rule without fundamentally challenging the gender order. Isabella of Castile similarly presented herself as an exceptional woman, chosen by destiny and divine favor to rule, even as the general principle remained that women were unsuited for power. This strategy worked for individual women, but didn't challenge the system that excluded women generally. It was a way to achieve personal power without advocating for women's power broadly. Strategy 7. Using cultural expectations strategically. Clever women could sometimes use stereotypes and expectations about femininity to their advantage. The assumption that women were gentle and merciful could be used to frame interventions in policy. A queen asking her husband to spare prisoners or reduce harsh punishments was acting within expected feminine roles, but she was also influencing justice and building political support among those she helped. The assumption that women were naturally pious could allow religious interventions in politics. A queen's support for church reform or particular religious policies could be framed as feminine devotion rather than political action. Even the assumption of female weakness could be useful. Opponents might underestimate a woman, assuming she'd be easy to manipulate or sideline, only to discover too late that they'd misjudged her capabilities. Strategy 8. Forming female alliances. Though less common than it might have been, women sometimes formed alliances with other women to exercise collective influence. Ladies-in-waiting could form factions supporting their queen against rival courtiers. Abbesses could coordinate with other religious women. Queen mothers sometimes worked with their daughters-in-law despite tensions, recognizing shared interests. These female alliances were often fragile. Women were encouraged to compete with each other and were often separated by rank and circumstance, but when they formed, they could be politically significant. Strategy 9. Intellectual and cultural authority. Women who couldn't exercise direct political power sometimes built authority through intellectual and cultural leadership. Eleanor of Aquitaine's patronage of troubadours and poets gave her cultural influence that translated into political soft power. Hildegard of Bingen's scholarly and mystical writings gave her intellectual authority that popes and emperors respected. Catherine the Great's patronage of arts and letters made her a cultural leader as well as a political one. Being seen as learned, cultured, and sophisticated could give women authority even in areas where they couldn't hold office. Respect for intellectual achievement could sometimes overcome dismissal based on gender. Finally, we can't overlook the importance of individual personality, intelligence, and will. Some women succeeded partly because they were simply formidable people who refused to be limited by what society told them they couldn't do. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Theodora, Catherine the Great, Isabella of Castile, these women succeeded partly through favorable circumstances and strategic thinking, but also partly because they were exceptionally capable, strong-willed individuals who would have excelled in any system. This matters because it reminds us that while structures and systems shaped possibilities, individual women still had agency. They could choose to accept limitations or to push against them. They could choose to make the most of limited opportunities or to create new ones. The most successful medieval women did both. These strategies weren't used in isolation. Successful women typically combined multiple approaches, adapting to changing circumstances. They were flexible, creative, and persistent in finding ways to exercise power despite formidable obstacles. Understanding these strategies helps us see that medieval women's power wasn't accidental or merely the result of individual men being generous. It was achieved through intelligence, political skill, and determined effort by women who refused to accept the limitations their society tried to impose. We've explored the remarkable power that medieval women wielded despite official exclusion. But if they were so powerful and influential, why are their stories so little known? Why has history largely forgotten or minimized their contributions? Let's examine the systematic erasure of female power from historical narratives and why recovering these stories matters. The problem of sources. Medieval history was primarily written by men, monks, priests, court chroniclers, who often had clear biases about women's proper roles. When they recorded women's activities at all, they often did so through a lens of disapproval or moral judgment. Consider how Procopius wrote about Theodora. He documented her power, he couldn't deny what everyone could see, but he framed it as scandalous, improper, and vaguely threatening. The fact of her power comes through his hostile account, but distorted by his determination to make her look bad. Similarly, Eleanor of Aquitaine appears in chronicles primarily when she's doing something chroniclers disapproved of, rebelling against her husband, interfering in politics, acting in ways that violated their ideas about proper wifely behavior. Her constructive governance, her diplomatic achievements, her cultural patronage get less attention than her dramatic conflicts. When women don't appear in sources at all, it's not because they weren't there or doing anything important. It's because the male writers didn't think women's activities were worth recording, or they attributed women's actions to men nearby. Attributing to men. A common pattern in historical records is attributing decisions and achievements to men even when women were responsible. When a queen regent made a wise decision, chronicles might credit her son, even if he was a child, her late husband, or her male advisors. When a queen influenced her husband's policy, the resulting decision would be recorded as the king's, with no mention of her input.
This means that to recover women's power, historians have to read between the lines, looking for indirect evidence. Who was present at crucial moments? Whose interests were served by particular decisions? What do private letters reveal about who was actually making choices? The great man theory of history. Traditional history has focused on great men, kings, generals, bishops, as the drivers of historical change. This framework inherently excludes women, who rarely held these offices. But this framework also misunderstands how power actually worked. Medieval politics operated through networks, relationships, influence, and informal channels as much as through official positions. By focusing only on formal office holders, traditional history missed much of the actual exercise of power. Women's power operated in these informal channels, through influence, networks, and relationships. A history that only counts formal authority as real power will inevitably miss female power, which was real but rarely formal. Moral judgments disguised as historical analysis. Medieval chroniclers often presented women's exercise of power as evidence of moral failing, ambition, unwifely behavior, unnatural grasping for authority. These moral judgments got embedded in historical narratives and persisted for centuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine was portrayed as a bad wife, a dangerous woman, too ambitious. Margaret of Anjou was the she-wolf, violent and masculine. Anne Boleyn was a seductress who manipulated Henry VIII. Modern historians have worked to strip away these moralizing frameworks and analyze what these women actually did and achieved.
But the old narratives persist in popular understanding, where powerful medieval women are still often portrayed as villains, seductresses, or dangerous anomalies, rather than as political actors exercising power skillfully in difficult circumstances. The public-private divide. Another reason female power was erased is the distinction between public and private spheres, with only public sphere activities considered historically significant. Women's power often operated in spaces defined as private, the bedchamber, the family, the household. But in medieval politics, these weren't really private spheres. They were venues for important political negotiations and decisions. A queen's bedchamber, where she met with ambassadors and advised the king, was a political space, but because it was also a domestic space, its political significance was sometimes dismissed. Similarly, women's work in maintaining family alliances, arranging marriages, and managing households was crucial political work, but because it was defined as women's work and associated with the domestic sphere, it was often not recognized as political. Exceptional women versus systemic analysis. There's a tendency to treat powerful medieval women as exceptional individuals, interesting precisely because they're unusual, rather than as evidence of broader patterns of female power. This framing, "Isn't Eleanor of Aquitaine remarkable because she's so unusual?" actually reinforces the erasure. It suggests that female power was rare and anomalous, rather than recognizing that many women exercised power in various ways, and that the system, while patriarchal, had more gaps and opportunities than we might assume. Modern feminist historians have worked to recover not just the exceptional women, but the patterns of female power, showing that women's exercise of authority, while constrained and contested, was actually quite common when we know how to look for it.
National narratives. Historical narratives are often constructed around national stories, the story of England, of France, of Spain. These national narratives traditionally focus on kings and male rulers because they're the official heads of state. Women who exercised power often don't fit neatly into these narratives. Eleanor of Aquitaine was Queen of France, then England, ruler of Aquitaine in her own right. Her story crosses national boundaries in ways that make her hard to fit into any single national narrative, so she often gets marginalized in all of them. Similarly, women who exercised power through international marriage alliances or religious networks don't fit neatly into national histories, making them easier to overlook. The Recovery Project. Starting in the late 20th century, feminist historians began systematically recovering women's history, including medieval women's power. This scholarship has revealed just how much was hidden or minimized. We now have much fuller understandings of individual powerful women, but also of the systemic ways women exercised power. We understand medieval gender systems as complex and negotiable rather than simply oppressive. We recognize that patriarchy didn't mean women had no power. It meant their power had to be exercised through particular channels and often couldn't be openly acknowledged. This recovery work is ongoing. New archival research continues to reveal women's activities. New theoretical frameworks help us understand how power operated in systems that officially excluded half the population from wielding it. Why does it matter that we recover these stories? Several reasons. First, accuracy. If we want to understand medieval politics, we need to understand who actually exercised power, not just who officially held titles. Leaving women out means missing crucial parts of the political picture. Second, representation. Women today deserve to know that women throughout history have exercised power, intelligence, and political skill. The narrative that women were always powerless victims is both historically inaccurate and psychologically limiting. Third, understanding systems of power. By studying how excluded groups like women nevertheless found ways to exercise power, we learn about the gaps in flexibility in systems of domination. This has applications beyond gender history. It helps us understand how all marginalized groups navigate exclusionary systems. Fourth, questioning assumptions. Recognizing that medieval women exercised significant power challenges assumptions about historical progress.
We can't simply assume that things have gotten continuously better for women over time. Some medieval queens had more power than many modern women. Understanding this complexity makes us think more carefully about power, gender, and historical change. Finally, inspiration. The strategic intelligence, resilience, and political skill of medieval women offer models and inspiration. These women navigated extraordinarily difficult circumstances with remarkable success. Their stories offer lessons in how to exercise power from positions of structural disadvantage, lessons that remain relevant today. The erasure of women from history wasn't accidental or neutral. It was a political act that reinforced narratives of male authority and female incapacity. Recovering women's stories is therefore also political. It challenges those narratives and insists on a more complete and accurate understanding of the past. When we recover the stories of queens who ruled in silence, we're not just adding interesting details to history, we're fundamentally revising our understanding of how medieval power worked, who wielded it, and what was possible for women even in systems designed to exclude them. Chapter 8. The Daughters' Inheritance. What they left behind. As we approach the end of our journey, let's consider what these powerful medieval women left behind, not just in terms of immediate political outcomes, but their longer-term legacy for subsequent generations of women and for our understanding of power itself. Institutional legacies. Some medieval women left concrete institutional legacies that outlasted them by centuries. Hildegard of Bingen's monastery continued long after her death. Her writings were preserved, copied, and circulated, influencing theological and medical thought for generations. In the 20th century, she was rediscovered by modern feminists and New Age thinkers, and in 2012 she was finally declared a Doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women to receive that designation. Isabella of Castile's support for Columbus led directly to Spanish colonization of the Americas, with all its world historical consequences, positive and negative. Whether we judge this legacy as good or bad, it's undeniably significant. Isabella's personal decision to fund Columbus's voyage changed the course of world history. Margaret Beaufort founded St. John's College and Christ's College at Cambridge University. These institutions continue to this day, educating students over 500 years after their founding. Margaret's commitment to education created lasting institutions that have served thousands. Many abbesses founded monasteries, established schools, built churches, and hospitals. These institutions served their communities for generations, sometimes for centuries. Even when the women's names were forgotten, their concrete achievements, the buildings, the institutions, the traditions, continued. Cultural and intellectual legacies. Eleanor of Aquitaine's patronage of troubadours and poets helped shape the tradition of courtly love that influenced European literature and culture for centuries. The ideals of chivalry, romantic love, and refined court culture that we associate with the Middle Ages were partly Eleanor's creation, or at least she was a major sponsor and promoter. Hildegard's compositions, both musical and written, influenced medieval culture and have found new audiences in the modern era. Her music is still performed, her mystical writings are still read and studied. Christine de Pizan, a medieval woman writer we haven't discussed in detail but who deserves mention, wrote the Book of the City of Ladies, an early feminist text defending women's capacity and dignity. Her work influenced subsequent thinking about women's roles and capabilities, creating an intellectual tradition of feminist thought that continued into the early modern period and beyond. Political precedents. Powerful medieval women set precedents that later women could point to. When women argued that women could rule, they could point to earlier queens and regents as examples. When women argued for education, they could cite learned abbesses and educated queens. These precedents didn't make later women's struggles easy, but they made certain arguments possible. You couldn't claim women were inherently incapable of ruling when Isabella of Castile had unified Spain or when Empress Theodora had saved the Byzantine throne. The existence of successful female rulers throughout history provided evidence against claims of inherent female incapacity. Family legacies. Many powerful women left legacies through their children and descendants. Eleanor of Aquitaine's children included 2 kings of England, Richard I and John, and her descendants included most of the royal houses of Europe. But beyond biological descent, there's the matter of influence and education. Queens who raised their children, particularly their daughters, with strong examples of female capability, were passing on more than genes. They were passing on expectations and models. Isabella of Castile's daughter, Catherine of Aragon, was well-educated, politically astute, and convinced of women's capacity for learning and governance. She brought these values to England and passed them to her daughter, the future Mary I. The tradition of educated, politically aware royal women was partly created and sustained by mothers teaching daughters. Methods and strategies. Perhaps most importantly, these women left behind methods and strategies that later women could use.
The playbook of how to exercise power without official authority, the strategies we discussed earlier, was developed through centuries of trial and error by women navigating patriarchal systems. Later women could learn from earlier examples, building on successful strategies and avoiding failed ones. The networks of female cooperation and support that occasionally formed in medieval courts created templates for later women's alliances. The understanding that women could work together to exercise collective influence, even in competitive court environments, was an important insight. Inspiration across time. Even when the specific details of medieval women's lives were forgotten or distorted, the general awareness that women had exercised power in the past provided inspiration. Renaissance and early modern women arguing for female education could point vaguely to learned ladies of the past. Advocates for women's political participation could reference queens and regents who had ruled successfully. The specifics might be wrong, but the general principle that women in history had demonstrated capacity for power and learning provided argumentative ammunition. In the modern era, as historians have recovered more accurate understandings of medieval women's power, these stories have become even more valuable as inspiration and example. Modern women can look at Eleanor of Aquitaine, Theodora, Hildegard, and others not as mythical figures, but as real historical people who navigated real constraints with intelligence and skill. Unintended consequences. Some legacies were unintended or would have surprised the women who created them. Theodora probably didn't intend to become a feminist icon when she saved Justinian's throne, but her famous speech about preferring death to flight has inspired people facing difficult choices for 1,500 years. Eleanor of Aquitaine probably didn't think she was creating literary traditions when she patronized troubadours. She was enjoying poetry and music while also building political influence. But the cultural movement she supported had consequences far beyond her immediate political goals. These unintended consequences remind us that historical actors can't fully control their legacies. Medieval women exercising power in their own contexts created precedents and examples that would be used in ways they couldn't have imagined. The legacy of silence. Paradoxically, even the silence and erasure that medieval women experienced created a kind of legacy. The recognition that women's contributions have been systematically undervalued and hidden. The fact that these women's stories had to be recovered, that they were deliberately minimized by male chroniclers, that we have to read between the lines to see their power, this itself tells us something important about how power and gender have interacted throughout history. The project of recovering medieval women's history is part of a larger project of recognizing and correcting historical erasure. Every silenced story that's recovered challenges us to wonder, what else have we missed? Who else was written out of history? What other forms of power and achievement have we failed to recognize because they don't fit our expectations? Limits of the legacy. We should also acknowledge what these women didn't achieve. They didn't overthrow patriarchy. They didn't fundamentally change the systems that constrained women's power. For the most part, they succeeded as individuals without creating systematic change that benefited women generally. This is partly because they were working within the system, not against it.
They were exercising power for themselves and their families, not campaigning for women's rights broadly. The concept of women as a group with shared interests was not really available to medieval thinking. Some even reinforced the system that constrained other women. A queen who claimed to be exceptional was implicitly accepting that most women were inferior. An abbess exercising power in a monastery might do nothing to help lay women access education or authority. This limitation is important to recognize. We can admire these women's individual achievements while also understanding that individual success within an unjust system doesn't necessarily challenge or change that system. The modern recovery. The final legacy is the modern recovery of these stories itself. In recovering and telling these stories, we're creating new legacies for medieval women. We're ensuring that they'll be remembered, studied, and honored in ways they weren't during their own times or for centuries after. This recovery work, done by feminist historians and scholars over the past several decades, means that medieval women's power is now part of the historical record in ways it wasn't before. Students learn about Eleanor of Aquitaine and Isabella of Castile. Theodora and Hildegard are no longer obscure figures known only to specialists. This matters because representation in history is a form of power. When we tell the stories of powerful women from the past, we change what seems possible in the present. We challenge the narrative that women have always been powerless and demonstrate that women have always found ways to exercise agency and authority, even in constraining circumstances. The daughters who inherited medieval women's legacies aren't just their biological descendants. We're all inheritors of these stories, these strategies, these examples of how to exercise power from positions of structural disadvantage. When modern women navigate male-dominated fields, when they find creative ways to exercise authority despite obstacles, when they build networks and use available resources strategically, they're using tools that medieval women helped develop. The queens who ruled in silence left us their voices, if we're willing to listen. We've journeyed together through centuries and across Europe, meeting women who shaped history while officially holding little or no power. We've seen how they navigated patriarchal systems, wielded influence through official and unofficial channels, and exercised authority despite formidable obstacles. Now, as we come to the end of this exploration, let's reflect on what these stories teach us about power, gender, and history itself. The nature of power. Perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is that power is more complex than official titles and formal authority. Power flows through relationships, through control of resources, through access to decision-makers, through cultural and intellectual authority, through the ability to build networks and alliances. Medieval women who lacked formal power often possessed substantial real power through these alternate channels. They prove that the map of official authority, the org chart of who technically held which offices, doesn't tell us everything about who actually influenced decisions and shaped outcomes. This insight matters beyond medieval history. In modern organizations, in contemporary politics, in any system, understanding how power actually works requires looking beyond formal structures to see the informal networks, the influence relationships, the behind-the-scenes negotiations that shape outcomes. Women's historical experience of having to exercise power without official authority has created expertise in these informal power channels. This is part of why recovering women's history isn't just about fairness or representation, it's about understanding power itself more fully. The creativity of constraint. Medieval women's stories are remarkable case studies in creative problem-solving under constraints. When direct paths to power were blocked, they found indirect paths. When one strategy didn't work, they tried others. They were flexible, adaptive, and creative in ways that people with easier access to power didn't need to be. This creativity born of constraint is inspiring. It shows that having limited options doesn't mean having no options. It demonstrates that systems designed to exclude nevertheless can be navigated by people who are clever and determined enough to do so. But we should also recognize the cost. Having to be twice as smart, twice as strategic, twice as perfect just to achieve what others get with less effort is exhausting and unjust. We can admire medieval women's strategic brilliance while also acknowledging that they shouldn't have needed to be so strategic in the first place. The goal isn't to celebrate constraint as somehow good for you because it forces creativity. The goal is to recognize human capacity for agency even in difficult circumstances, while working to remove the constraints so that future generations don't have to work so hard for what should be accessible to everyone. The importance of telling these stories. Throughout this exploration, we've seen how women's power was systematically minimized or erased from historical records. Recovering and telling these stories is therefore an act of historical justice, correcting the record, acknowledging women's contributions, and refusing to let their achievements remain buried. But it's more than that. These stories change our understanding of what was possible in the past, which changes our sense of what's possible in the future. When we know that medieval women, living in far more patriarchal systems than modern ones, nevertheless found ways to exercise power and authority, it challenges narratives of female helplessness and expands our sense of possibility.
These stories are also valuable for their strategic lessons. Medieval women developed sophisticated approaches to exercising power from positions of disadvantage. Their methods, building networks, controlling access, strategic patience, framing actions in acceptable terms, are still relevant for anyone navigating systems that marginalize them. And these stories complicate simplistic narratives of historical progress. We can't simply say that things have gotten continuously better for women. Some medieval queens had more power than many modern women. Understanding this complexity helps us think more carefully about progress, power, and the relationship between formal rights and actual influence. The complexity of assessment. As we've encountered these powerful medieval women, we've had to grapple with how to assess them. Were they heroic resistors of patriarchy? Collaborators who reinforced oppressive systems by succeeding within them? Pragmatists doing the best they could in difficult circumstances? The answer, of course, is that different women made different choices, and even the same woman might be all of these things at different times. Eleanor of Aquitaine was both a woman exercising remarkable power and a noble who benefited from and reinforced feudal hierarchies that oppressed most people. Theodora used her power to protect vulnerable women and also to persecute religious dissenters. Isabella of Castile ruled successfully as a woman and also initiated the Spanish Inquisition. We can acknowledge both their achievements and their limitations, their power and its costs, what they did for themselves and what they failed to do for other women. Historical figures are complex, and our assessments can be nuanced. Silence and Voice. The title of this exploration is When Queens Ruled in Silence, but of course they weren't truly silent. They spoke, they advised, they commanded. But their voices were often not recorded, or were dismissed as less important than men's, or were attributed to the men around them. The silence wasn't theirs. It was imposed by chroniclers who didn't value women's words, by systems that didn't officially recognize women's authority, by centuries of historians who focused on men and treated women as tangential. But the voices were always there, and increasingly we're learning to hear them. We're reading letters, examining diplomatic records, analyzing policy decisions, and recognizing the evidence of female influence even when it wasn't explicitly credited. Recovering these voices from silence is ongoing work. There are still many medieval women whose stories we don't know, whose contributions haven't been recognized, whose power remains hidden in archives, waiting for historians to find it. The universal and the particular. These stories are both universal and particular. They're particular to their specific historical contexts: medieval Europe, Christian culture, feudal political systems, specific women in specific times and places. But they're also universal in what they reveal about power, gender, human ingenuity, and the capacity to find agency even in constraining systems.
The specific strategies medieval women used might not all translate directly to modern contexts, but the underlying principles, building networks, controlling resources, framing actions strategically, being patient and persistent, are timeless. Women and other marginalized groups in every era have faced the challenge of exercising power in systems designed to exclude them. Medieval women's experiences offer both historical insight and practical wisdom for anyone facing similar challenges today. Gratitude and responsibility. We owe these medieval women gratitude for their achievements, for their resilience, for the examples they set and the precedents they created. We owe them the effort of recovering their stories and telling them accurately, neither minimizing their power nor exaggerating it, seeing them as complex historical actors who made real choices and had real impacts.
We also have a responsibility to continue the work they began. They created small openings in patriarchal systems, proved that women could wield power effectively, and left behind strategies and examples. Our responsibility is to build on their achievements, to expand the opportunities they created, and to work towards systems where women, and all people, can exercise power without having to be twice as brilliant, twice as strategic, and twice as perfect. The power of history. Finally, these stories remind us why history matters. History isn't just about the past, it's about how we understand ourselves, our societies, and our possibilities. When women are written out of history, it seems like women have never been powerful, never been important, never been capable of shaping events. But when we recover women's history, we discover that women have always been there, have always mattered, have always found ways to exercise agency and authority, even when systems tried to prevent them. This knowledge is empowering. It changes how we see the present and what we think is possible for the future. The queens who ruled in silence have much to teach us still. Their voices, recovered from centuries of dismissal and erasure, speak to us across time with messages of resilience, strategic thinking, creative resistance, and the persistent human drive to matter, to have impact, to shape the world according to our vision and values. Closing thoughts. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the hidden corridors of medieval power, where women shaped the course of history despite all the obstacles placed in their paths. I hope these stories have inspired you, taught you something new, and perhaps changed how you think about power, gender, and history. If you found value in this exploration, please subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into hidden history. Share this video with others who might appreciate these stories, and most importantly, drop a comment below telling me which historical woman's story you'd like to hear next. Your engagement makes this work possible and helps determine which stories we tell. Remember these women. Remember that power has always been more complex than official titles suggest. Remember that excluded people have always found ways to exercise agency. Remember that history is full of silenced voices waiting to be recovered and heard. And perhaps remember to ask whose voices are being silenced today, whose power is being exercised in ways that official records won't capture. Whose stories will future historians have to work to recover? The queens ruled in silence, but we don't have to. We can speak their names, tell their stories, and carry forward the work they began. We can listen to the silence and hear the voices that were always there, waiting to be heard. Until next time, dear travelers through history, may you rule boldly, whether in silence or in song, and may you never forget the women who came before and showed us the way.